Okay, so today we're going to talk about consciousness. So cognitive science is divided into two competing theories on the role of consciousness within human agency. This debate has been raging for thousands of years, really. Yet, what is the solution? Philosophers have been asking this question since the axial age. Yet, for all of our reasons, we merely have the mind apprehending itself and with consciousness making statements about itself. Case in point, control in cognitive science went through a phase of being described in terms of causality. This goes all the way back to the behaviorism of Watson, Holt, and Weiss, who attempted to extract consciousness from the equation by just looking at pure behavior. This is the behaviorism within psychology. They sought to describe psychology only based upon that which can be observed objectively from outside. So the question then is, what sensory inputs cause a certain action? Control as regulation, in contrast, is the way that a system works in order to keep an event in a particular state. For instance, a person seeking to balance on a slack line or a piece of thick cloth strung between two trees. This brings into play an idea of alignment with how nature expresses itself within living organisms. Self-organizing systems. From this perspective, consciousness is seen as a higher level in the development of systems that regulate and organize themselves. Information processing theory promotes that non-living, non-purposive systems are unable to sustain ongoing relationships with the environment. Thus, their course is determined by the environment itself. In contrast, purposive systems are able to relate dynamically to the environment. And so this is the differentiation between living and non-living beings, between that which is alive as an open system and that which is not. This is the question that Schrödinger, for instance, asks within What is Life, or Lynn Margulis within her response, her reflection of this type of questioning. So, back to consciousness. We can look to consciousness as an epiphenomenon arising within the human process. This is one perspective, which is to say that some purport that within the phylogenetic process, humans evolve consciousness, not as a thing within itself that is shaping the actions, yet as something which arose merely just as something arising from the relationship between the self and others within our development. And so in some way, from this perspective, we're aware of the process that's going on, yet consciousness is not necessarily shaping our experience. And this is an argument that's made on many degrees. Some people attempt to completely reduce consciousness. And there's a whole spectrum of this. So how do we reconcile this? Some things do feel like they're simply in our control. Some things take more effort than other things. We feel that we're maybe imposing our will to change something in our environment, to manipulate our own course through it, to stay on track despite environmental attempts to disrupt us. So some phenomena appear conscious, and this is also worth mentioning, that some phenomena do not. And this brings us into mind dual process theories of cognition. So it evokes these particular theories I'll mention briefly. These theories propose that most of what we do is actually based on automatic, non-conscious processes that come to us either genetically or through our experience or through some combination of the two. So these are basically habits of our behavior that dictate our actions. Once an action is repeated enough times, it becomes internalized. And once an action becomes internalized, it becomes automatic. Even complex actions can be internalized. For instance, driving a car, shooting a swish in basketball, simply by consciously tossing the ball in the direction of the hoop. It'd be pretty difficult if we had to calculate all these different permutations and trajectories and complex neural modeling equations, for instance, that allow us to propel the ball in a certain trajectory to make it into the hoop at just the right time. We don't think about all that. We just simply shoot it. And even automatic actions could include performing an action as complex, for instance, and precise, potentially dangerous as surgery. So, another development within our understanding, moving back to this human consciousness perspective from the dual process model, digression if you will, is that of dynamical systems theory. So, dynamic systems theory proposes a complex understanding of cognition by adapting itself to the study of human consciousness. Now, this is in keeping with the regulation approach of consciousness in certain ways, for instance, and specifically of systems organizing themselves. So, within the human mind, we could see this as the interactions of a complex feedback of activity within our brains, our consciousness, and our actions. The idea of a system organizing itself, however, does not necessitate a self that organizes the system, an agent who does the organizing. Rather, simply, it supposes that there is a system. So, Kelso, for instance, in cognitive domain, speaks to how, from this perspective, intention is a specific form of information acting within these dynamics to create attractors that sort of move a system towards a certain state. So, from this perspective, intentions are sort of intrinsic aspect of our systems, stabilizing or destabilizing them. Consciousness is unique to humans, particularly within our ability to process elements of our systems that are brought into the light of our awareness through, for instance, language. Now, how do we reconcile these information processing models and dynamical systems theories with how consciousness may have an impact on our actions, or may not? So, neither information processing theory or dynamic systems theory has provided a full account of consciousness. For instance, according to J. Scott Jordan of Illinois State, who proposes, essentially, that information processing theories and dynamic systems theories each don't fully represent the true nature of consciousness, and more accurately, that organisms are best seen as self-sustaining energy transformers. These self-sustaining energy transformers have emerged spontaneously through the prebiotic soup, and this refers to a theory by Kaufman. Now, this brings us back to systems that are able to relate dynamically to the environment, and it contrasts purposive systems with non-purposive systems. Within this process, we can see that the emergence of life is that of the emergence from non-sustaining chemical systems, non-purposive systems, to self-sustaining chemical systems. So, systems can be said to be self-sustaining when they are autocatalytic. That is, they produce their own catalysts within themselves that can be applied. So, systems produce a catalyst either to speed up the reactions of a system or to facilitate a reaction within another system. These systems are not isolated, however, characterized as being rather open systems, which means that they sustain themselves through continuous intake and transformation of other systems. This is the process of consumption and transformation that occurs within our interface with the environment. Consciousness, from a perspective that acknowledges interface with the environment, then becomes useful in other tangible ways, beyond shaping the internal systems themselves. So, if we were to split some of the impacts of consciousness, some might propose that consciousness allows us to shape our own internal systems by creating these sort of attractors that lead our systems to different results. So, for instance, tangibly this might take place through self-examination, inquiry, and attaining a certain cohesiveness and purpose as a result, shaping our internal systems. Yet, if we look to the second element of this, we could see that cognitive theorists such as Powers express that we are conscious beings, and we as conscious beings are able to control our inputs within our system. So we are conscious and can select which systems we choose to integrate with. Whether these selections are truly choices arising from consciousness or rather within consciousness as a product of existing belief structures, crystallizing into intentionality, we can discuss that further. However, this is an applied principle. So, for instance, when we choose which environments and systems that we expose ourselves to, we are shaping our course from the natural trajectories which arise, determining our course within the environment. Statements, for instance, like you're most similar to the core group of people that you surround yourself with, for instance, to bring this within practical life, or the positive books, the information that you're consuming as an individual, eating some books for breakfast. These developmental contexts that you place yourself within have an influence upon the mind. And this relates back to our conscious ability to shape our inputs, even in just a basic sensory way. Now, beyond this, we can recognize that our inputs integrate us within something larger than ourselves. And so our system is comprised not only of individual subsystems, yet of our relation to other organisms. Now, J. Scott Jordan describes this process as the relationship between autocatalytic systems to macro systems within micro-macro synergies. So we describe ourselves as a microsystem that is a necessary component for a macro system in which we are embedded. So even from this perspective, single-cell organisms are able to sustain themselves by controlling the inputs that they have in a very basic way. For instance, even the intake of particles of food through a membrane, very simple forms of life, for instance, and animals consuming plants or animals consuming other animals and other systems. This relates essentially to the transmutation and conversion of solar energy through food chains of systems. Yet consciousness has the feature of shaping our process of interface with the environment and other systems. So back to the perspective of inputs, we can see that consciousness may indeed not cause actions to happen, yet consciousness, what it can do is constrain potential action trajectories. And so J. Scott Jordan creates wild systems theory, for instance, to integrate these other perspectives insofar as that action, perception, and cognition each apply these autocatalytic systems in order to integrate them into increasingly distal domains of space-time. So within this perspective, breaking up some of the fundamental parts of this paradigm, we can see that action is defined as control of our somatosensory inputs, our body basically, related to the environment, and how our senses lead us to act within our physical bodies themselves, what our body does. And basically this would be akin to a view of behaviorism if we just stopped here. Just looking from the outside, not going in the black box, so to speak, of consciousness, just relegating it, kind of setting it aside, and not even looking at mental constructions even, prior to the cognitive revolution. Now, when we reach the cognitive revolution, we can bring into account that perception is the control of the distal effects of our action, and cognition then becomes the control of virtual effects or simulation of our perceptions, which are based in turn upon our actions. So there's action, perception, and cognition. So within this model, we can see that consciousness arises between the interplay of our autocatalytic processes. So consciousness, once more, is not about controlling actions. Rather, it's about generating and sustaining possible body-environment relationships that can constrain action systems towards producing certain other trajectories and relationships. And so here I quote, "Since these systems are shaping the process, it's not surprising that cases may be found where one does not cause the other. It does not, as some have argued, as consciousness manifest in conscious will, yet this is merely an illusion." So if we take this perspective of a radical perspective of consciousness, also a dialectical perspective, which is pretty flexible and resilient, basically just saying that we don't need to over-reduce consciousness or to completely preclude the existence of consciousness because some causal relations don't take place. And rather, we can acknowledge that consciousness has perhaps a constraining influence and a sustaining influence. And we can see some instances where it wouldn't align with the old causal model, and that's fine. So if we bring this into practicality, and perhaps something a bit loftier here, in order to just make some connections between principles, we could connect this potentially to the macro system level. So for instance, how about the Earth as a whole? This ties sort of this perspective into deep ecology and the ecosystemic acknowledgement of our interrelations with the Earth system. And within this process, we really are attaining a higher level of sorts of understanding of ourselves and who we are. And, further digressions, we could even maybe look to the spiritual or transcendent traditions and see that some of what they're teaching, for instance, the interbeing of Thich Nhat Hanh, the compassion of the Dalai Lama, some of the Hindi discourses of Osho relating to inter-empathy, samanubhuti, could relate to cultivating our awareness and consciousness specifically of these domains of interconnections and relationships between ourselves and systems larger than ourselves, by acknowledging, for instance, back in a more tangible, earthy way, our interplay within Earth ecosystems, or even within domains below this macrosystem of the mesosystems, we might say, that are embedded within our own means of interfacing with the Earth in terms of our human societies and communities. And so we can see that this really draws our awareness beyond our individual microsystems and allows us to create catalysts for these larger systems. In a way, we are expanding our own fragmented conception of who we are, because within this certainly could be drawn to nebulous, fuzzy, woo-woo, fuzzy logic about how our intentions cause reality, yet in a way, our intentions do create attractors that affect the structure of who we are to a certain extent, and that will affect our trajectory and course within time based simply on how conscious we are of our relationship between inputs of other tangible relationships with systems, and what this means to interact with other systems. So these are just some things to keep in mind that could potentially expand our conceptions of our relations sort of beyond this fractured, isolated individual ego that we characterize as being in some way static and not built of a collection of psychophysical aggregates that really themselves are constantly changing in a psychological and neuro level. Even beyond sort of our linguistic ability to displace ourselves or to simulate the future and displace ourselves into the past, we can see that we are really essentially connected to these macro systems of our community that we work within, and even of our ecology, and potentially the Earth system as well, from which we gain our sustenance, both in kind of tangible and other ways. Now, once we move past some of the layers that fragment us, such as these different levels of societal conditioning, we might ask ourselves how we could align ourselves within the systems and processes that are most beneficial to us. For instance, the people that we care about, the causes that we support, humanity, and the natural world as a whole, which is really, if we think about it, the most broad and distal relation that we have to larger systems. The natural world encompassing all of the systems that come within it. And so, in doing so, perhaps we might think of how we could act as catalysts for these other macro systems in order to learn more about who we are as individuals within a process of individuation that leads to transcendence. So I hope you enjoyed this sort of distinctive look on the side, kind of building on some of the principles and this terminology, maybe weaving some prose perhaps. Though, I'm happy to share this with you. I look forward to speaking more on hypoegoism, for instance, and how the neuroscience relates to our conceptions of individual self, and also how peak states such as flow and creativity arise in the brain, and more so as to what is really self-relating systemic influences, how these can take shape, and also how these apply to broader swaths within the cognitive, psychological, and developmental literature more broadly. Of course, keeping these philosophical underpinnings flowing, these kind of juicy ties to the humanities and the broader aspects of prose that reflect our capacity. And so, with that being said, we might be able to draw some inspiration and influence from hypoegoic states, or even what's happening in the brain from the perspective of science, as well as within these perhaps more prose-filled ways along the way, so as to bring this into further focus. And so I hope that you enjoyed this look at our consciousness, and I hope this gives you some things to think about. as to, you know, what part of you it is, maybe, that is conscious, and how that relates to the rest of you, and even what this you that we're speaking of really is, where that ends, what our membrane is, for instance, of the individual self, or if you conceive of ways in which you're related to some of these broader domains beyond us. And so, yeah, I hope that you find some interesting tangents and connections of your own to think about and explore this literature as well more, which we'll explore in future videos. And we'll all talk to you soon.